Come on in, take a seat. We're in for an absolute treat. For those of you who hasn't been to the Karoma Temple previously, can I just see a show of hands if you haven't been here before? Lovely, welcome. It's lovely to have you for the first time. We have 2,500 square metres, of which there are 1,200 indoor plants that have been grown indoors. And one of our underpinning ethoses for the company is sustainability. The inventor of the first dual flush within the world. So Dr. Steve Cummings is on staff. And again, the reason we did this Sustainability Expo is because one of our underpinning ethoses is sustainability. And in alignment with that and in conjunction, we have people that we have coming to speak today, including Lottie Dalziel, who is from Banish. We also have Phytogreen, who are talking about greening built structures, creating vertical gardens and rooftop gardens, and what plants to buy to keep your house and home looking and smelling fantastic. We have Alfonso, who's speaking about the planet and your footprint and what's creating. But most importantly, we have a fabulous speaker who probably doesn't need a great deal of introduction. For those of you who've seen the Sugar movie and also those that perhaps have seen 2040, we have Damon, who's come to join us all the way from Norfolk Island today. Norfolk Island. He was on Norfolk Island. Please put your hands together for Damon this morning. Yesterday I said Fraser Island, that's why I'm clarifying.
Thank you, Deb. Thanks for coming, everybody. I just thought I'd share a bit of my story today, my journey, and what I've learnt over the last 6 years of really being deeply immersed in more of a solutions space than a negative space. And it started for me because I was a father of a young daughter and felt pretty overwhelmed by what she was facing in her future, and felt very well equipped to talk to her about the problems that she was going to face, but felt woefully inadequate in terms of offering solutions or sharing with her some of the ideas or people that were doing great things around the world. And I found myself reading an article about a coral bleaching event in 2016, and I didn't even get halfway through the article when I turned the page and started reading a different article. And I stopped myself and I thought, why couldn't I connect with that article? I'm someone who does care about the planet. I care about my daughter's future, but I found no entry point into that particular piece I was reading. And so I reached out to a few different psychologists to talk about the way we communicate many of our ecological challenges. And she told me that when we only hear information that comes with fear and dread and overwhelm, it does activate this part of our brain, the limbic system. And when our limbic system's activated, it shuts down the parts of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, where we think creatively and we problem solve. So we've really only been using that one form of narrative to bring people on side with this argument. And it's actually inadvertently probably paralysed millions of people around the world because they just feel so hopeless about it. And then if you think of the stories we tell in our mainstream narratives, our blockbuster narratives, they very rarely talk about these issues. And also we show visions of the future that are largely dystopian. You know, every Hollywood film shows a future with no nature, robots chasing humans that usually live in slums. And these are the images that we're showing to our kids. This is a future that we're dropping into their subconscious, that if we're not careful, we'll just march straight into. So I thought there was an opportunity to offer up a different vision. And so I've spent the last 6 years researching and making a film called 2040, which is ostensibly a letter to my daughter, showing her what the world could look like in 2040 if we simply embraced the best solutions that we have available today. And I called it an exercise in fact-based dreaming. Everything I show her in the future has to exist now in some form. So what I'm passionate about is this idea of regeneration. How do we regenerate so many of our living systems on the planet and our social systems? We stand at a precipice right now and a fork in the road. And if we continue doing what we're doing, I think we all know intuitively where that's going to end up. But we have an opportunity to use this crisis as an opportunity and to talk about and show people what life might look like on the other side of this crisis, because there are so many benefits to be had. So I just want to take you through some of the major things we need to do in the coming decades to actually reach a more regenerative future. And the first one is, obviously many of you will be familiar with this, but this is our beautiful planet that's hurtling through the galaxy at more than 100,000 kilometres an hour. We've got to stop emitting carbon into the atmosphere. I think we all know that. And if you can see from this picture, a lot of people don't understand just how fragile our atmosphere is. We think we're sort of beneath this giant ocean, but it's actually thinner than the skin of an apple by comparison. And so we're digging up all these fossil fuels underground and we're putting them into that atmosphere. And for millions of years, we've cycled carbon around the planet. It's been in our atmosphere, it's been under the ground in fossil fuels, it's in our soils, it's in the ocean, and it's in plants and us. And it's moved between those 5 areas. But right now, we've knocked that balance out and we've put too much into the atmosphere. And as a result, we are now 1.1 degrees warmer than pre-industrial temperatures. And we're seeing the fires that we're seeing the heat waves in America right now, the huge storms in Mount Dandenong in Victoria that happened last weekend. That's at 1.1 degrees. And we're on track for 3 to 5 degrees of warming. And we've got to halve our emissions by 50% in the next decade to stay under 2 degrees warming. And that's why there is so much urgency around this issue. And I can talk later, but we are largely doing the right thing in many parts of the world, unfortunately not in Australia, but in other countries there is real progress in this space. The second thing we need to do is actually draw down that carbon from the atmosphere and put it back to where it came from. And if we do this at the same time as lowering our emissions, we'll drop our temperatures a lot faster. And while we talk about building sort of giant carbon sucking machines on the edge of our cities, this carbon capture storage, we forget that nature has been doing this practice for millions of years. She's an absolute pro at it. So if we can restore some of these natural ecosystems, they will sequester the carbon, but they'll also provide habitats for these animals that we've decimated and wiped out. 96% of the animals on our planet now are humans, cattle, and our pets. 4% is the wildlife. That's how much we've done in a very short amount of time. So some of the ideas, this is called an azolla fern. It's a very tiny microscopic fern, and 50 million years ago there was something called an azolla event. And these ferns bloomed in the Northern Hemisphere and they took our parts per million from 1,300 down to 600 in a very short amount of time. In fact, a lot of the oil that people are digging for in the Arctic now are these fossilised azolla ferns. So scientists are now trying to find ways to bring them back so they can take that carbon out of the atmosphere, but they also act as really great filtration systems in the waterways. So as they grow, they take all the nitrates and all the pollution we've put in our rivers, and then the ferns themselves can be fed to animals, and they're very, very high in omega-3. So there's a nice closed loop that we could create by rolling these out. Seaweed, if anyone's seen 2040, this is just the most glorious solution because it grows 0.5 metre a day. It's one of the fastest growing organisms in the world. There are 14,000 varieties of seaweed. And not only do they pull that carbon out of the atmosphere very quickly, but they help to alkalise the ocean water, bring back the habitats. And now lots of organisations are using the seaweed for lots of different material use. So there's bioplastics now out of seaweed. McDonald's has just ordered 1 billion straws made of seaweed plastic and they just dissolve in hot water. People are making clothes out of seaweed. We could use it for biofuels for aeroplanes. So there's lots of uses. We're going to hear a lot more about seaweed in the coming decades. Sea grasses, again, this is something we don't hear anywhere near enough about. We know grasses on land are able to take carbon out of the atmosphere. But in fact, the oldest living organism in the world is 200,000 years old. It's in the Mediterranean. And it's a set of seagrass. It's a big patch. And it's pulled so much carbon out of the atmosphere in 200,000 years that it sits on 36 feet of soil. That's how the power that nature can do. And you can see from this picture, we put the seagrasses back, we give a habitat for the ocean life again, which again is desperately in need of it. And then many of you might have heard about soil and the role of soil and what that can do in terms of sequestration. That soil on the right is representative of our Australian soils right now. We have around 0.5% of organic matter in our soils. They're some of the oldest in the world. And this soil on the left, that's getting up to more 8 or 9% of organic matter. And that's because that carbon from the atmosphere through certain regenerative practices on farming pulls the carbon back into the soil. And once it's in that soil, it kickstarts all the life and the microbes in the soil. In one handful of healthy soil, there's 8 billion microbes. And we've only studied 4% of them right now. And in that 4%, we know they have antidepressant properties and they're very good for our own gut flora. So again, this is such a beautiful advantage. If we can get our soils healthy, that gets passed on to the food, those microbes go into the food and then they go into our own guts. And many of you will know how much damage we've done to our guts by using excess chemicals and the leaks and all the metabolic symptoms we're seeing now because of our unhealthy gut flora. It's directly correlated to the health of our soils. And in our country, it's also the ability to hold water. Every time you get that healthy soil, it creates little air pockets in the soil and that's able to capture the rainwater. So it acts like a sponge and doesn't run off taking all these floods that we're getting right now because they're just washing into our river systems and often just taking the chemicals with them. So the best way we can return and restore our Murray-Darling Basin is to fix the land around it, because then the water goes in, it seeps back into the aquifers and goes into the rivers. And this just isn't being talked about in the way it should be. The other thing we need to do, which often doesn't get talked about, is that we need to protect the carbon that's already in our system. All the old growth forests, the mangroves, the peatlands, the wetlands, even if we cut down 10% of those, we'll knock our parts per million up by 100. So we've got to preserve and protect what we already have. And the last thing we have to do, which is probably our biggest challenge, is that we have to acknowledge that we have a degenerative economy, that our economy is not serving many of our social systems, our democracy is suffering, income inequality is massive, but we're destroying the natural world with our economic practices right now. And we have to try and switch to a more regenerative economy. We're using 100 billion metric tonnes of resources now every year. And that's minerals and metals and plastic and livestock and timber and all these inane things we make like little Coles toys or foot spas, all these things that we're using materials on and we're throwing away. This is the damage it's doing. The earth can only replenish 50 billion every year. That's the sustainable amount, and we're on track for 180 billion. In fact, at our current growth rates, which all our politicians and many CEOs really aspire for 3% growth a year, our economy will be 7 times bigger than it is now. And you think of the ocean plastic we already have, the deforestation we already have, the income inequality, 7 times bigger. It's just madness. And no industry is immune. Take, for example, the fashion and footwear industry has the same emissions as the beef industry, 9%. A new garment is bought every 5 days. 68 pieces of clothing we buy each year. And 30% of the clothes we're making aren't even making it to the customer. They're going straight to landfill. So all the chemicals we're using, all the soil we're destroying to grow these fibres, and then we're throwing it away. Not to mention using 80 trillion litres of water every year that we could be using for a host of other sources. So it's a massive challenge. We've got a huge job ahead of us, and people often ask me, what do we do? What are the first steps that we can do? And I think more literacy about our economy is a first step, and to understand that so many of our taxes that we pay are not going to the things we value, like democracy, our health and the environment. They're largely deregulating and subsidising huge global networks that are expanding and creating more and more of this destruction. And at the same time, we're overly regulating and heavily taxing our local and small businesses. So we've got to turn those cogs around so we're promoting more of the local. We all want more local things. We all want more governance and control in our communities. We're not getting that. So that's one of the first steps. And I've also been working with Paul Hawken, who's a US environmentalist, about this concept of regeneration. What does it actually mean? And how do we talk to businesses and policymakers about what it stands for? And these are some of the questions that we should be asking already. Does it heal the future or steal the future? Any business you're starting up or any policy that's being implemented? Does it mine the land or bring it back to life? Does it increase connection or sever it? And I think most importantly, does it address real human needs? Or does it manufacture human wants? Because that's our system right now. How do we create people wanting more things that they don't actually need? And this is driving more consumption, driving more growth. And I think we know now it's not making us happy. These aren't the things or the values that are fulfilling us. So again, there's a huge opportunity to change our system and create a much better world for all living things. And that's that fork in the road that we're at right now. So I want to switch to, because of today's event, the idea of the built environment and cities and our houses and what role they play in some of these large ecological issues. And they do play a huge role. 70% of our emissions come from cities: electricity, manufacturing, heating and cooling, and transport and waste. And there are 4.3 billion people living in cities. Yes, they're part of the problem, but they're also a huge part of the solution. And from my research and talking to people around the world, the benefits from us electrifying our cities and making them more greener are absolutely enormous. Studies in Baltimore and Vancouver and Chicago have showed that once more greenery is added around a city or into spaces like this, it lowers the crime rate, it lowers acts of violence because the nature suppresses our fight and flight response. We feel calmer. We've evolved in these spaces. We've just severed ourselves from them. And what we can't see right now, even in this room, is that all these plants are emitting hormones. They're emitting bacteria that we can't see that's having a calming effect on us. And you might have all felt it as you walked in today. You just feel something subtle when you're surrounded by nature. So this is what we should be doing to our cities. Studies also show that just by adding 40% more trees to our cities, we can cool them by up to 5 degrees. So that has a massive impact on our health, obviously, but it's something we're going to have to do as we move forward and the climate gets warmer and warmer. And then there's the obvious one, the pollution that no one talks about. In 2018, 9 million people died as a result of air pollution caused by fossil fuels. 1 in 5 deaths of that year. So that alone should be a reason to switch to renewables as rapidly as we can without all the political rhetoric we get around climate change. This is what's at stake. So obviously my work is about trying to kickstart people's imagination and get them to dream about a different future. Because right now, our future is being decided by large organisations. And then we blindly walk into that future that they're creating. So how do we find a way to reclaim the future that we want? What are some of the things we want to see in our cities? So I just want to take you through an exercise of imagining what a regenerative city might look like in 2045, if we have implemented many of these things and we've got them right. So imagine that it's a Friday afternoon and you're sitting in a city park. You don't work on Fridays anymore because there's a universal basic income and that's been subsidised by penalising the fossil fuel emitters. So it's great. You can only work 4 days. And you close your eyes and you lie down on the park and the first thing you notice is the sound because the combustion engines are gone and it's just electric vehicles in the city now. And that's had a huge change on the soundscape. And the breath you take in is cleaner because the fossil fuels aren't in the city anymore. And even the smells are different because every rooftop on the buildings is now a garden or a veggie garden. And so the pollinators have come back. And so's the bees, and so's the bird life. And because there's 40% more trees in the city, there's more animals and wildlife around that you can hear and smell. You start peeling a mandarin that you've just picked in the local park there because picking policies are now a thing throughout the city. And then you glance at a building over the road from the park and you see a huge dashboard that's replaced a lot of the advertising. And it displays all the city's resource uses, the waste streams, how much is going to landfill, even meat consumption, the energy use, the water that's been captured. We've made the invisible visible and we can all see our collective input onto that city and how it functions, which makes us take more responsibility. And that screen, that dashboard is attached to a building that's covered in glass. And that's a solar glass that was invented just recently. And so the energy, the building is generating more energy than it's consuming. And there's greenery cascading down the side. And that excess energy is now going to renters that can't afford panels or can't get panels on their roofs or for other industries. And you decide, well, I might head across town. I've got a few options. I can walk. I can take an e-bike or an e-scooter on the new designated paths that are covered in greenery. But today I feel like a coffee, so I'm going to actually dial up a driverless cafe pod. Because fewer and fewer people own cars anymore because of the price of registration and insurance and petrol. People now subscribe to transport networks. In the same way that we do Spotify or Netflix, it's much cheaper and easier. We don't own the DVDs or the CDs. Fewer people don't own cars because it's cheaper just to subscribe to these fleets. And they move around our cities, and there's boardroom pods and office pods and library pods, and there might be sleeping pods, and there's cafe pods, and there's delivery vans. But because of this, there's no parked cars in the city anymore. So the parking bays and the side of the roads have all been repurposed for recreational areas or urban food projects or bikeways. So you sit back in your chair with your coffee and you watch through the glass and you pass through the city and you see people interacting. There's a smile on their face. And you notice that a stream that used to run through the city, the pavement's been ripped off and the river's flowing again and all the bird life has come back to the city. And even a busy road that was there 20 years ago is now an eco-corridor to allow wildlife to pass through the city. And it's spectacular. There's a food forest through there, native Australian animals, bandicoots, quolls, echidnas, and a whole huge school group that's there on an excursion. Now, if this sounds like some kind of utopian fantasy, everything I just mentioned then is happening in some part of the world right now. Every single bit there. There are eco-corridors starting up in cities. France and New York have just regulated any new building has to have a rooftop garden or solar panels. Adelaide's planting fruit trees right through their city at the moment, especially to feed the homeless. China has said by 2030 that 80% of their cities will capture 2/3 of the rainfall. And the solar glass that I mentioned, invented in Oxford 5 years ago. It's already being rolled out onto iPhones, onto car windows to generate electricity. So I do think, from my research, that we have an opportunity in the next few decades to move away from an industrial civilization towards a more ecological civilization. There is so much awareness in this space now that ingenuity and creativity and finance is pouring into this kind of area in more than it was even 2 or 3 years ago. And it's my opinion that in 300 years, historians will look back at this moment and say, imagine being alive then. Like an entire human race transition their energy. That's going to happen in the next 25 years. It's well underway. An entire population move to electric transport. We're seeing that. Not in Australia, we're absolutely dragging the chain. But in other parts of the world, like Norway, 60% of their cars, new cars, are electric. Biden's just rolling out 500,000 EV chargers across the US. We've only got 7,000 petrol stations, to put that in perspective. In agriculture, we're seeing a massive shift to more regenerative practices, like I showed you. We have 40,000 farmers in this country and 10,000 of them are doing organic, biological or regenerative practices, 1/4 already. And we have huge organisations that are saying to their suppliers, unless you're protecting the soil, unless you're covering the soil, we're not going to take your products anymore. So that's going to happen in the next 20 years. And we know, we've heard from Lottie today, what's happening in the circular economy space. It's being built into the DNA of these new companies. Even these lithium batteries now, 95% of them are recyclable. The new wind turbines, 96% of them are recycled. They are embedding that into their structure. In fact, the EU's introduced legislation that says any solar panel manufacturer has to collect their panels at the end of use and recycle them. So this is being just embedded in the way we operate, and we'll see this change in the next sort of 20 or 30 years. So all of us need to ask what role we are going to play in this historic moment, because we all do have a role to play. And I guarantee you all of our grandchildren will ask us what we did back in the 2020s. It's inevitable. And we do have the opportunity for huge change right now. I'd urge all of you, if you haven't seen 2040, go to our website, whatsyour2040.com. There's an action plan there where we ask you the type of person you are, what you're passionate about, how much time you have. And we've partnered with almost 100 different organisations to offer you up your own personalised plan that gives you 6 or 7 things that align with your values to get started on. And meet up with other people. So many people want change, they just don't talk about it enough. But so many people want change. So get together with others and approach the principal at your kid's school and say, we want solar, we want food gardens, whatever it might be. Approach your boss at work. There is strength in numbers. And approach your MP. If you get together a group of people, I've seen it happen. 30 or 40 people writing a letter together to an MP has far more impact than you writing a letter on your own. They get scared when they see large numbers. And I'll leave you with my favourite quotes from Robert Swan. No, it's not. I forgot to mention this, which is also being built right now as we speak. 437 acres, 30,000 residents. It's the first forest city in China that sequesters 10,000 tonnes of CO2 every year. There's another one yesterday that's just being approved in Singapore as well. Very similar design. So this is already happening. The greatest threat to the planet is the belief that someone else will save it. We have to be the saviours, all of us. Thanks for listening.
Are we inspired to make the world a better place? I know I'll be talking to my bosses afterwards about making change.
Yeah, you need more greenery in here.
We do. We certainly do. Who can still smell the mandarin? Thank you. We've got a couple of questions that I've got for you, Damon, and then we'll open up to the audience a little bit later. Thank you so much. That was so inspiring. Thank you so much. It's just it's wonderful to have you in the Karoma Temple. Obviously, as I'd said earlier, one of our underpinning ethos is sustainability, and water saving is paramount for us as a company. But to have you in here and advocating that on our behalf as well, it's just a lovely thing to do. So thank you kindly. Here's the question for you. Can cities actually operate on 100% renewable energy?
Yeah, they can. Absolutely. That's the short answer. I think what we have to understand is that the grid of the future looks fundamentally different to what we have now, and it requires a paradigm shift in the thinking. That right now we very much have a centralised power source, and that's from coal, obviously, in our country, and then it radiates out from that central point. But the future grid that people are designing now is very much dispatchable and decentralised. So I imagine our grid in probably 2040 in Australia will be taking energy from the winter sun and the winter winds up in far north Queensland. We'll have offshore wind farms that are also operating. There'll be large-scale solar farms in the middle of the country. And then we'll have huge rooftop arrays, which we already do. And that grid will all talk to each other depending on when it's needed. And so the people on the East Coast will reach, because of the time differences, we might even get energy sent from WA while it's still sunny, or SA while it's still sunny, while people need it the most on the East Coast. And there's even now parts of Europe where the grid is able to access parked electric vehicles to use that as storage as well. So if someone isn't using that, they can sell it back to the grid and make money from that. So absolutely, and this is what's hair-pulling about our country right now, is that no one thinks we need gas. No economist, no scientist, no other world leader, because we have the technology through the batteries, and not just the lithium ones, but all sorts of batteries that are emerging. And their costs are plummeting so rapidly that absolutely we could do it. In fact, California, which is the 5th largest economy in the world, aren't using any gas because they think they can power their entire state with renewables and battery storage. So again, this is the opportunity we have, especially in our country, with the amount of solar and wind. We should be absolutely leading the world in this space. And we've got 300 million people in Indonesia that are moving off coal that are going to want our expertise and our energy. We've got coal, Japan, South Korea, all these Asian countries that are going to want to shift. They've got less land mass than us. So we can be using hydrogen to convert into ammonia to send that off. We can be building these, like the Sun Cable project, which is building a line to Singapore now from a solar farm in Tennant Creek that will power 25% of Singapore. We should be just incentivising and rolling this out much faster than we are. Instead, we're still, because of our links to extractive industries, trying to build more gas and more coal.
And so you're talking about other countries perhaps leading the way. How do you think we're faring as a country?
Look, at an individual level, it's extraordinary. I mean, 2010, we had 110 solar setups across the country, now have 2.3 million. So people have taken responsibility into their own hands, which is great. But unfortunately, and it's not just me saying this, is people I speak to overseas, they say, what the hell are you guys doing? Like, what's your government doing? That our states are quite proactive, but our federal, unfortunately, we have a polluted democracy as much as our atmosphere in this country. We have the PM's chief advisor, John Kunkel, and Brendan Pearson, both former executives of the Minerals Council. So we've made so much money off coal that they're reluctant to give that up. And I kind of understand it to a degree, but they're not willing to look at the new opportunities. So unfortunately, when you combine that with a heavily controlled press, we are the most concentrated in the world. There is only one narrative that's being perpetuated. So a lot of really good people just don't understand what's going on here because they're just reading one source of newspaper. And that's being heavily controlled. So, but I feel we're close to a tipping point. I think if you look at all the recent studies, the majority of Australians want change. There's a tiny minority that's opposed to it, but they have the microphone, they have the money and the fire sources, and they have the narrative control. And so they are projecting and controlling a large group of that middle group.
So this morning I washed my hair with a shampoo bar and felt very proud of myself that Lottie was selling. And I mean, it's a small change, right? Friday we had a continuing professional development point for our architects and designers, and it was around sustainable CPD points. Have you got any architects or designers in the house today? Just curious. Any renovators? So I guess the question that I have for you is, it's education. What are some of the new emerging building materials that we can perhaps be specifying when it comes to looking after our environment?
Yeah, I guess largely most of our materials now are based on, they're rock-based, like the steel and whatnot, and they are a huge contributor. I think it's 12% of our emissions come from the manufacturing of steel. And our regulations heavily favour that type of building, but what is emerging are natural fibres being used. So obviously huge wooden structures. There's a tall building movement that's happening around the world right now. And Norway just built an 18-storey skyscraper out of wood that absolutely is fire resistant as well as any other. Joost Bakker in Melbourne's done a great example of using magnesium sheets, which is a waste product that's a really fire resilient material. There's huge amounts of straw that gets wasted, especially through Asia, and people are making sort of walls with that straw fibre now. So we're seeing, some of these materials can actually sequester carbon even when they're in the built space. So not only are we storing the carbon instead of releasing it, but it can actually start sequestering. So these can be carbon positive buildings. But there's a lot of work to do in the regulation space. As we know, building waste is a massive issue right around the world. So there's a fair bit of work to do there. But again, we also need to be careful. We don't want to increase deforestation to build more wooden skyscrapers. We can use cut down bits of wood, other woods, build sustainable practices. So it's going to take a much more nuanced and complex thinking than just going, let's just build with wood. So
beautiful. So you use your story to try to make change, and obviously that's evident. But why is that, and how important is storytelling in this moment? I think I was having a conversation with Callie Vandermeer, who's a prolific designer in the restaurant and hospitality space, and he said to me, you know, the thing that we do best when we hear speakers is to hear the story. And we look back to our Indigenous Mother Earth, and really storytelling is sort of part of the Australian culture. How important is that for you and the storytelling at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously very biased, but I think it is the most important thing. I think we're a species that's evolved to tell stories. And especially in the climate space, we've largely used facts and data and statistics to try and move people. And statistics are useful, but they're lifeless. So we need to encase those statistics in narratives that stir and move the soul. And I think if you look at any civilization, and I've looked back at sort of some of those early islander explorers, like in the Austronesian expansion, and they went to these islands and they quickly decimated the islands and overfished and cut down too many trees. Easter Island, there's lots of examples. But as new arrivals came in, they realised that they had to imprint the wisdom of sustainability into those systems. So they developed new myths and songs and ritual and cultural memes that could get passed on from generation to generation. And right now, our cultural myths and our narratives are largely being orchestrated by huge advertising agencies on the behalf of massive monolithic entities. And they are the values that we're perpetuating. So unless we address that deep truth and the core of how do we interact with each other, how do we interact with our natural world, because right now it's separate from us, it's extractive. We have a story of nature that we don't see ourselves being a part of. But every tradition had a very different view of that before Christianity and the scientific revolution. They had animist beliefs that believed there was a current of life through all living things, including us. So we've got to retain that and get it back somehow. And I think that's where our kids are so crucial. They kind of get that. They're born with that in an innate way. But if we can nurture that in them, teach them the magic of nature, teach them its value, then they will protect it as they grow up. They'll fight for it because it has meaning. And anything we have meaning with, we want to protect. But my generation and older, that's been severed. So we don't understand what's around us. So I think arguably that's the most important thing we can do.
Lottie mentioned earlier that she hadn't realised that the dual flush wasn't in pre-existence prior to her birth, but sort of dates. So, you know, if we're looking at moving forward, what projects are you bringing in yourself? You know, that's something that we've seen in our lifetime, but what projects are you bringing in? What are you working on to...
Oh, well, you know, since the film, we released it in Australia 2 years ago, but it's still, you know, releasing around the world. It's just started on Netflix in Europe. And so we keep getting these different groups that see it or organisations that want to do things. And I think what has been beautiful about it is that it's getting people to dream again and imagine what their vision of the future might be. So we're getting sort of bombarded on all sorts of narrative pieces and vision pieces, and some of them are really beautiful projects. Like one we're doing at the moment is in the lead up to COP in October, we're doing a piece that's going to be projected onto the skyscrapers of 7 major cities around the world, including the Vatican. They do all the digital mapping where they do that. So trying to really bring this kind of topic of regeneration into the mainstream in a huge focus. And I'm also doing this project now, which is incredibly rewarding, which is called Regenerating Australia. And it's like 2040, but it's a vision for Australia in 2030, and showing all the solutions and what impacts they would have on communities and our landscapes. And that was based on interviews with thousands of Australians over the last year, asking them post-COVID and the fires, what kind of Australia do you want in 10 years? And the number one word that came up was community. We want our sense of community back. We're sick of decisions being made from a long way away of the nuance and complexity of our own region. But even conservative farmers talking about wanting greener hills again and flowing rivers. The president of the gun club in Bega telling me that we need more Indigenous wisdom. You know, he's a 70-year-old conservative farmer, you know. So I do think we have a unique moment to actually talk about a better Australia that we want and all the opportunities and all the benefits economically and ecologically that would bring.
Do you think you might do your pre-screening here?
I will now. Yes, that's fine. Yep. But I will say what's exciting about that project is, you know, I'm setting it as a 20-minute piece. So it's very accessible. And it's a news report in 2030 looking back at the decade that was. And we've got Kerry O'Brien and Sandra Sully and Natasha Belling and all these very identifiable faces that are reading these news stories of the next 10 years. And it's been so lovely to hear them saying, I just hope I get to read this. Like these are the stories I want to be saying on Channel 10. And then WWF and a few others have put together a multi-million-dollar fund off the back of it. So we're going to take it to 50 towns around the country. And people, if they see something that they resonate with, can apply for that funding and go, right, well, here's a $200,000 grant. Get going. Build it. Do your urban veggie patch, your community battery, whatever it might be. Actually give people a leg up to start, because that's often a barrier. People have these great ideas, but they don't know what the first step is.
Who's inspired by that? I'm just so inspired. We spoke a little bit, I mean, we're in a slightly difficult season with COVID, and there's a lot of depression, there's a lot of disconnection. We've all been, I mean, from the renovation perspective, renovations haven't stopped because people are now in their homes and working from home and can't travel, and money's being tipped into renovations. But I guess for me with COVID, it's been, and for many, it's a chance to reboot, a chance to go to your naughty corner and reevaluate what life looks like moving forward. How do we make a better place and a better planet? So we were speaking about Melbourne and the property down there you were telling us about. Perhaps you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on what you're saying, I do think I was very hopeful at the start of COVID. I thought this was going to be an opportunity. The door was open and we could rush through it. And we have in a lot of ways, but we've also doubled down on the system, unfortunately. But I think what it has shown for people is when you have such a tightly wound global system that's just so geared for efficiency and saving every dollar, there's no slack in it. So when something goes wrong, like COVID, just horrible things happen where, pesticides couldn't get to Africa anymore, so they had locust plagues, or people couldn't get their medicine from China because they were the only supplier. So I think it has made people think about our own sovereignty around manufacturing and energy and food. We heard a lot about the toilet paper wrestles, but seeds also sold out across Australia because people planted their own gardens for the first time. So it has, in a way, shifted us to understanding more about what it means to be local and the protection we're going to need, because we're going to get more pandemics. We're going to get more climate shocks. That there's an opportunity, we have the technology now to have our own energy in our community, to have our own food networks. So I do think that's going to help. And I think what you're talking about is Jost's place down in Melbourne. So if anyone's been down there yet in Fed Square, Jost Bakker, who's a terrific advocate for waste and zero waste, he's built an example of what a future home could look like as a food system as well. And the whole place is made with these magnesium sheets and straw bales. And you walk in the front door and there's a huge wall of different varieties of mushroom growing. And he's taken the shower, the steam from the shower, diverts so it washes over the mushrooms to keep them growing. He has what's called an anaerobic biodigester, which you can all get for about $800 these days. It's like a two-man tent that sits in your house or out the back, and you put your food waste into it and it generates methane that you can then use to power your cooking and whatnot. And I think the ratio is for 1 kilo of food waste, you get 4 hours of methane gas burning. So, creating this loop. They've got solar panels capturing their rainwater, growing veggies all around the place. And you can go and have dinner there. They'll cook a meal for you, but also you can take kids through there and have a tour and just show what we could be doing in terms of these positive buildings. So there are so many people, as I said, just doing extraordinary things right now. We're just not giving them the attention we should be in our mainstream narratives, which is why I do what I do.
The controlled media, right? So after spending 6 years working in this space, are you more optimistic than when you first started?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a different form of optimism, though. I feel it's more grounded and muscular than it was because I have spoken to so many people. And I read recently about this thing called the Stockdale paradox. And Stockdale was a guy who was a prisoner of war in Vietnam, and he obviously went through all sorts of atrocities over 7 years. And he talked about his relationships with different people. And he said the ones that were largely pessimistic and nihilistic about their scenario, they died very quickly. And even the ones that were optimistic actually died very quickly because they'd often say, I'm going to get released by Christmas. And then Christmas came and went and they just lost all hope and they passed away. It was the ones that actually faced the reality of their circumstances and knew what was going on, but had this radical hope, this unwavering faith that we could get through this. They were the ones that actually made it. And I think that's really applicable to this moment when we're bombarded with all these dystopian stories and we see the collapse of so many things. Absolutely, you've got to face that in its all its reality. But I do believe in humans, and I do believe in the ingenuity and the creativity that's going on right now. It's extraordinary, even at the highest levels of power, even if they're not being vocal about it and they know how ensnared they are in the current system. They have kids, they care about the future, and they're trying to unravel from that mess. Not all of them, but a huge majority of them. So I think whether it's by 2040, but I certainly think by 2060, we're going to have a fundamentally different looking society that we probably can't even really imagine, but it will be ecologically based, given the amount of research and science that's going into exploring the benefits of nature onto us now. And once that hits the mainstream, I think there'll be a tipping point.
So exciting. Throwing to audience, questions please. James, come. I'll come.
Damon, thank you for that. That was incredible. Have you heard of Dr. Zach Bush? Yeah, cool. Have you heard of his talk on glyphosate?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, cool. Glyphosate scares me. So that's where it comes down to the limbic situation. Like, I'm wanting ways to try and navigate that in my setting of working with gardens. And also I am scared of the future in terms of, in some areas of the planet, it rains glyphosate, and even organic farmers have found challenges to maintain their integrity with that. And even what you're talking about, the microbiome in the gut and the long-term effects of that. A recent thing out of the Geelong Hospital has said that pregnant women, their children have, if they have a healthy microbiome, stronger cognitive functioning in their children. So I'm just, and the slyness of like a company like Bayer buying out Monsanto when they're going down with glyphosate, and now they've got another product that they're wanting to release that isn't, Roundup, but it's just as bad. Like, just how to tackle such a thing like that.
That's a pretty massive question for a short answer.
Sorry.
But yeah, I mean, for people that don't know, just really quickly, what happened in this green revolution in the 60s in America and then came here was that this discovery of, feeding the plant to get more yields from the farmer, which was great, and it's great, but it absolutely destroys the soil, and those chemicals are washing into our waterways. They're evaporating into our water cycles, and in many parts of the world are now raining down. So even people that are doing organic practices, they're finding traces of glyphosate, this chemical, in the food. I think, from my experience, what farmers are realising is that those chemicals feed the plant, but regenerative agriculture feeds the soil. And once you feed the soil, the health of the plant increases so dramatically that they're saving money in terms of input costs. They're not having to spend that money on those chemicals. They're getting higher value for their products with the consumer. And from the people I've spoken to, in the next 2 years, and there's already one version of this, but people will be able to go to a supermarket and see a QR code and scan the fruit and veg, and it will give them not only the supply chain, it'll give them the nutrient density of the food, the health of the soil that it was grown in, and really bring again this education around the impacts of our food and what's in the food. So that's going to send a signal to the farmers to change their practices, because people are going to start demanding that more. And as I said, a lot of these farmers are already doing this. So I know Zach quite well, and he's even said that if 16% of farmers globally reach these regenerative practices, it will be enough to knock the sales of glyphosate down. So they will lose their market power because it won't be a viable product anymore. So yes, it's a mental shift for these farmers, and I think we need to understand that a lot of them are under incredible duress. They're in debt. They're getting screwed over by supermarkets. It's very hard for them to take a risk and make this change. So we need to incentivise them. It's just madness that we're not helping out our farmers more and allowing them to switch to these practices. But again, this comes to the flawed architecture of our system, that we are subsidising these huge global companies like Bayer who are destroying our ecosystems and our health. So we've got to reverse the cogs of that, and that comes through awareness and literacy and more of us talking about it. But it's a massive challenge,
Damon, firstly, thank you for such an inspiring session. I think one of the things for me personally is it's such an overwhelming concept, as per the Robert Swan quote that you've got up there. From your perspective, if there were to be one outcome for all of us from this session today, what would you want us to do differently so we can at least try and eat the elephant in one small bite to start off with?
Yeah, I mean, I'm loath to say the one thing, because I think we have been too prescriptive with this. We've said to everyone, just eat less meat and ride your bike, and actually not everyone's going to relate to that. So I think it's about finding the thing that lights you up in particular. And it might be ocean plastic, it might be food waste and composting, it might be educating girls and women. Find that thing, and then you're more likely to see it through, you're more likely to talk about it with your friends and family. It becomes a passion that you're not going to be knocked off if you get a naysayer. So that's why we built this whole platform, the 2040, What's Your 2040, to help you distill what that thing is. So I'd encourage everyone to go and do that. But also just talk about it more. We're not talking about it enough. And not in a way that's antagonistic and bullshit and is going to shut family members down. It's coming from a space of listening and heart and saying, these things are important to me. And you don't even have to say climate change when you're talking about healthy soil in our gut, but you're also talking about climate change without even mentioning it or descending the argument into some kind of political debate. So we just need to be more strategic with how we talk to each other about it. Softer, less activist bullshit, ego pushing, and more humanising. We haven't humanised this enough. It's still stuck in this climate babble talk or sustainable, and people just go, it's not for me. So it's actually finding new ways in.
Hi, so very quick question. What's your source of inspiration waking up every morning?
Well, I've got 2 daughters now, one's 7 and one's nearly 2. And I'm obviously aware of the multiple pathways that their future holds, and then some of them are pretty confronting and pretty scary. So it's that's my motivation, to try and find the people that are doing great things and amplify their work, because I've seen the evidence now from this platform we built. We've brought to life this seaweed platform. We've had people educating girls. We've had 50,000 teachers that have downloaded the materials because people are looking for stories of inspiration and hope. They're sick of being paralysed by the doom and gloom messages. But if they can see what another community's done, or a corporate sector or an individual, they're more inclined to go, wow, I can do that too. It's empowering. And then you just see this ripple effect start to happen. And that's happening around the world. So I do think storytellers are so pivotal in this moment, because our job is to shape culture. So I want more artists and filmmakers and musicians to bring this stuff to the fore and affect people emotionally, so that they'll make the change, because the graphs and the stats aren't doing it. They're just not doing it. And I pull my hair out when people get up and they give an hour lecture on how bad things are and they show graphs. It's like, great, but what do we do with that? Like, far out. They play a role, but they need help from creative. And we're all creatives. We're all storytellers. And so we've all got a role in this moment to use that.
Final question. Is there another question?
Once you go onto your website and you find out what your passion is, what other tools are there on there to help you go forward in
Yeah, so what we've done is linked up to all these other organisations. So you say one of your issues is educating girls and empowering women around the world. We send you to a few different organisations that have different ways of helping that. And there might be a financial donation. We've got lots of our community that mentor a girl once a week online and help that education process. And that's actually been really powerful for people. Whatever direction you want to go in. And then you also get sent to a group where our group regularly shares ideas and discusses things. And we have, next week, we've got a big tree planting day that they're all getting together to go out and get involved with. And we're about to launch this, which we think is going to be the largest citizen science project in the world. It's called the Great Platypus Search, because the platypuses, as you might know, are on the brink of extinction in parts of the country. So there's a group, our group's going out, taking their kids and doing all these soil water samples to send back to the scientists. So just trying to find ways to bring people together and keep the momentum going so they feel like they're actually contributing. So you'll see once you fill out the quiz, it gives you lots of different options of where you can go.
Direction, I guess it's the next steps, isn't it? So the greatest threat to the planet is the belief that someone else will save it. I just hope today that you've been inspired by Damon's story, his choice in life to make a difference, and the fact that he's actually doing that. So, Damon, thank you so much for joining us today. It was an absolute pleasure, honour and privilege. Put your hands together for Damon, please.